Healthcare is too expensive. Employers are offsetting costs onto their employees. Who will make health benefits affordable for hard-working Americans and their families?
You will! This is the Empowering Plans Podcast, a show dedicated to helping you once again emphasize the benefits in your benefit plan. Now prepare to learn,
Plan,
save,
and protect with the FIA Group.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest installment of the FIA Group's podcast, Empowering Plans. I am attorney John Jablon, and with me today is attorney Kendall Jackson. Kendall, will you say hello to our viewers?
Hello, everyone. Thanks for
Thank
joining.
you. And I say viewers because, our podcast used to be audio only, and the last couple of years they've been video. So our friends in the audience went from listeners to viewers. And I hope that having us on video makes everything completely different for everyone. I know I love being on video more than audio, but, here we are. And I know that that's the way of the world. And I'm trying to, my wife is always telling me, like, no, everything's video now. Like, she's scrolling through social media, watching videos. And I'm just like, this is all so strange to me because I don't do any of that. But it just blows my mind that videos are the new pictures, right? And sound only is like a thing of the past. Who's, like even in cars, right? You drive by on the highway and you just see everyone's like watching videos. I'm like, how are you driving? It's
That's
insane.
concerning.
Yeah. Oh no, it really, really is. So anyway, hello everybody. Thank you for joining us. Today we are going to be talking about a topic that is very popular, and it is Medicare. For a lot of reasons, Medicare is very popular in the self-funded industry. One of the main ones is claims repricing, right? I mean, tons and tons of plans use Medicare as a basis to reprice their claims. That is not what we're going to be talking about today, actually. That is a huge topic that we, and particularly I, have talked about numerous times through the years. And I feel like every day I talk about Medicare-based repricing and the ins and outs and the good and the bad, et cetera. But today we're going to be talking about Medicare from a different standpoint, and that is other ways that plans use it, and the Medicare Secondary Payer Act in particular. So as some background on the Medicare Secondary Payer Act, right? It was a federal law and set of regulations passed by Congress essentially to try to preserve the integrity of the Medicare system. One of the large theories underlying the MSPA is and I hate saying this because it sounds weird, but the anti-dumping rules. The idea is that if health plans are dumping their sicker and older populations onto Medicare, Medicare will no longer be sustainable because Medicare will be fielding all of that higher risk population's claims where, self-funded employers can just sort of get rid of that risk and just sort of sit pretty covering their young and healthy populations. And Medicare said, we can't do that. Medicare will disappear. We will cease to exist if that is the case. So the Medicare Secondary Payer Act tries to preserve, like I said, the integrity of the Medicare system. And for better or for worse, it does a decent job of that. There are a lot of employers who, they see large claims and they say, look, Medicare would be a great way to cover these claims. They're not sustainable for our self-funded plan. This is actually becoming a real problem. There's stop-loss lasers, et cetera, et cetera. But the law is the law. And, we're all sort of in this same boat where the law is drafted broadly enough that it covers the vast majority of situations and ideas that plans and vendors and TPAs have. So let's dive in. The Medicare Secondary Payer Act, it talks about the primary and secondary nature of Medicare, right? There are lots of nuances of exactly what it talks about, but its main purpose is to talk about when Medicare is primary, when Medicare is secondary. So the Medicare Secondary Payer Act, you could take it, the name at face value, the Secondary Payer Act. It is not the Medicare Primary Payer Act. It is the Medicare Secondary Payer Act because usually Medicare pays secondary. That's part of the issue. If Medicare paid primary and then protected individuals from balance billing on the back end, I think plans would be happy. But no, Medicare is designed to be a secondary payer when applicable. And it's also important to note that the Medicare Secondary Payer Act separates its rules based on the impetus, the reason for Medicare, right? There are slightly different rules for ESRD or disability-based Medicare than there are for age-based age-based Medicare. But for what we're going to be talking about today, the rules are the same with one very small nuance that we'll get into in a little while regarding ESRD. But yeah, generally, when Medicare is primary, or whether it's primary, depends on whether the employer has 20 or more employees, right? So if you're an employer with 3 employees, these rules don't apply. The rules are different, right? Medicare secondary and primary sort of swap in that scenario, which is that's designed to be a little bit more feasible for tiny employers, because the MSPA, for better or for worse, it realizes that the very small employers will have legitimate cash flow problems, right? If Medicare is always paying secondary. That being said, the difference between a 20 employee employer and a 30 employee employer is often negligible, right? I mean, they drew the line in the sand, and that's what we have to deal with. But why exactly they chose 20 as the threshold, I'm not really sure. So yeah, if you have any questions about what exactly that number is for your organization or one of your clients' organizations, and when that's calculated, feel free to reach out to us and we can help with those calculations, or to elaborate on the regulations, or whatever it may be. So with that, let's move on to the idea of taking Medicare into account. And that's one of the main things that the Medicare Secondary Payer Act talks about. So Kendall, will you tell us about taking into account?
Sure. Yeah, so the MSP rules sort of broadly prohibit health plans from taking into account Medicare eligibility or enrollment when determining benefits and eligibility for active employees on the group health plan and their eligible dependents. When it comes to age-based Medicare, the nuance there is that it's usually for the active employee and the spouse. But it sort of prohibits group health plans from taking into account an active employee's eligibility for Medicare for actual entitlement and enrollment in Medicare. And so we've seen sort of different approaches that health plans try to take to sort of just as a method of cost containment, but they're actually not necessarily permissible under the rules. And so there's a few different ways that we see this happening. The first one I'm going to talk about is non-compliant plan language. And so the first way we sort of see this come about is broadly stating that Medicare is primary sort of in every circumstance. And ERISA plans specifically in the self-funded space have sort of broad flexibility when determining coordination of benefits, but they don't when it comes to coordinating with Medicare. And they can't sort of just broadly state that Medicare is always going to be primary and the plan is always going to be secondary, because the MSP rules are what govern this. So one example of this is we saw in a plan, it said, if, however, you choose to make Medicare your primary plan, you may not supplement your Medicare coverage with benefits of this group health plan. And that's really interesting, because for one, a plan or plan participant is sort of unable to just sort of dictate that either Medicare or the plan will be the primary payer in any case. They can't just sort of broadly claim that Medicare is primary, because like I said, the Medicare secondary payer rules govern when Medicare is going to be primary or when it's going to be secondary, depending on the circumstance of that individual. The next example of plan language that we see sort of taking Medicare into account is going to be terminating an employee for enrolling in Medicare. And so usually this is just a provision in the termination section of the plan that says a plan participant's coverage will terminate on the date that the employee becomes enrolled in Medicare. And so this is really a prime example of taking Medicare enrollment into account. They're literally terminating coverage based on enrollment in Medicare. When you actually look at the MSP rules and regulations, they have a certain section that gives certain examples of what taking Medicare enrollment or eligibility into account is, and this is one of the examples that it gives. And it says that terminating coverage because an individual becomes entitled to Medicare is a prime example of taking Medicare into account. So that's going to be another impermissible type of plan language. And then the last sort of element of plan language I wanted to talk about was where a plan attempts to reduce benefits for employees who are eligible or enrolled in Medicare because they are 65 or older. And you, again, can't do this. The MSP rules require that plans provide to employees who are age 65 or older, or to their spouses age 65 or older, the same benefits that the plan provides to employees who are under the age of 65. So you can't just arbitrarily reduce benefits because somebody may be enrolled or eligible for Medicare. Again, that's going to be taking Medicare into account, and the MSP rules prohibit you from doing that. So another instance we see is trying to coordinate with Medicare. So do you want to talk about that, John?
I do. Oh, I love this topic.
Me too.
Yeah. So we very often see questions come into our consulting team, or we see plan language that does this without asking questions, where essentially the plan says, even if you don't enroll in Medicare, we are going to pay benefits as if you did. In other words, we are going to coordinate. It's funny. I'm looking at my video on the screen and it's kind of narrow, so I can't tell what is actually on the screen or not. And I know Pat could cut this, but it doesn't matter. We can leave it in. But so I can't see if my air quotes are coming in. But you're coordinating with Medicare, even though Medicare is not actually a payer. And in our view, that is a big problem under the MSPA because it's effectively a punishment if a person doesn't enroll in Medicare. You're basically saying, you should enroll in Medicare when you can, but even if you don't, we're going to pay benefits as if you did, meaning if you don't enroll, we're going to reduce your benefits. It's not coordination of benefits, right? That's how it's couched a lot of the times with plans and vendors when they're looking at it and they're saying, no, we're coordinating with Medicare even if you didn't enroll. Well, if you didn't enroll, there's nothing to coordinate, right? If there's no secondary payer, then you're the only payer and you can't coordinate anything. It's really just a way to try to justify what really looks like a punishment for non-enrollment, right? And we're not saying that anyone is trying to frame it that way. We're not saying it's malicious. It's certainly not. It's a way to try to contain costs. But federal law doesn't like it because it falls into the sort of incentive or disincentive bucket, which is the next thing that I want to talk about. So that's a really good segue, because one other thing that the Medicare Secondary Payer Act does, and does a very broad job of, is prohibiting incentives. A group health plan is prohibited from providing any incentive, financial or otherwise, right? And we'll talk about some examples here of the otherwise, but they can't be incentives to opt in to Medicare instead of the group health plan, or to drop coverage on the group health plan in favor of Medicare in any way. And, there's a lot of overlap with these concepts, right? Because the fine line between offering an incentive and a disincentive and what seems like a perk, or, as Kendall's going to talk about, education, I mean, they get a little bit blurry, right? I called it a fine line, then I said it's blurry. Maybe that doesn't make sense. It's a line. It's a fine line. It's also blurry at times. It's a tightrope. How about that? I'll just mix all these metaphors. It's a blurry, fine tightrope. Whatever. It's tough to know what crosses the line between cost containment and an impermissible incentive under the MSP. And I'll be honest, that has not been helped by regulations we've gotten, right? Because these laws and regs, they were put out, I mean, some of them well over a decade ago, right? We haven't gotten any real Medicare Secondary Payer Act. We haven't gotten any real new guidance in quite some time. So when these questions arise, everybody needs to just sort of do their best to figure out what's going on and use what the regulations say is a good faith, reasonable interpretation of the regulations and the law. And we can all only do what we can do, right? But there are some things that are going to be gray areas. There are some things that, even when we opine, we definitely think that the Medicare Secondary Payer Act prohibits this. We see people who say, we disagree. This is a judgment call. And obviously, we're not going to sit there and argue with you, right? We give our opinion. So when you're hearing what we're saying here today, think critically about it, and think critically about everything, right? I mean, just because we're attorneys doesn't mean that our opinion is the only one out there. But in our experience, anecdotally, after looking at, maybe hundreds, maybe even thousands of plans and analyzing particular situations, these are the the conclusions that we have reached, and they do tend to echo the sentiments expressed by the regulators as well, even though there isn't necessarily concrete law on these. So with that in mind, some examples of incentives that we strongly feel are non-compliant. One is a cash opt-out. So, that's basically just a fancy way of saying, if you're eligible for Medicare, we will give you $300 or whatever to drop coverage from our plan and enroll in Medicare. I mean, to us, that's textbook incentive, right? I mean, we're literally saying, if you drop our plan and enroll in Medicare, we will give you money, financial incentive. I mean, in my mind, it doesn't get much more clear than that, right? That's something that the Medicare Secondary Payer Act does not want plans to do. There are ways, I don't want to say there are ways around it because there aren't, but there are ways to do something like that compliantly. And one way is to structure it as not specific to Medicare. So in other words, if there are other options, a plan can, in certain situations, say, we will give you an incentive to opt out of our health plan, period. And then, of course, if there are individual market, individual market plan subsidies, or if there's, significant Medicare enrollment there, it can get a little bit more complicated. But if it's applied to individuals who drop the plan in favor of, say, a spouse's group health plan or something like that, that is compliant. And that's something that health plans can do. But when it comes to Medicare or, for a separate conversation, but individual market coverage subsidies, it gets much more complicated compliance-wise. And another one that we often see is about trailing spouses or dependents. And what we mean by that is it's very similar to the cash opt-out, but instead of saying, if you drop our plan in favor of Medicare, we'll give you money, instead a trailing spouse or trailing dependent provision is basically saying, if you drop our plan in favor of Medicare, we will let your dependents or spouse stay on the plan. You're giving a benefit in exchange for the individual dropping the plan in favor of Medicare. When I said before, financial or otherwise, that's the or otherwise. I mean, really, there is one interpretation where it's financial. You might not be giving cash, but you're giving coverage that has value to spouses and dependents that would normally otherwise not be eligible. You're basically saying, we're going to give you this extra special eligibility in exchange for you agreeing to go on to Medicare. And then, of course, programs like that typically have elements of, once you go on to Medicare, once you sort of accept our terms, you're no longer eligible for our plan, which is another parallel issue, right? Where you're then basically saying this individual is not eligible for our health plan because he or she is on Medicare. That's a problem unto itself and a totally separate one, right? So it's related to the sort of incentive in general, but when you start to give these incentives, really the only way to make these work is by just sort of compounding issue after issue after issue under the Medicare Secondary Payer Act. And at some point, what seem like loopholes will no longer be open because there's just so many of them there. And we don't really view these as loopholes, right? We view these as, like I said before, even if you adopt a different interpretation, it's going to be a stretch, right? Any way you look at it, when you're giving an incentive to drop coverage in favor of Medicare, you're doing what the Medicare Secondary Payer Act says you should not be doing. So interpretations aside, there are some clear rules, at least, and we think that these are examples of them. So the question that organically comes up in these discussions is, okay, what can we do, right? Medicare is an option and people maybe aren't enrolling because our group health plan is so good. So what do we do? Kendall, what do we do?
Yeah. Well, the answer is that you can educate your members and participants. You just have to be very, very careful to not cross the line into encouragement. And because CMS guidance essentially is very clear that even if an incentive isn't actually offered, a plan still can't encourage somebody to elect Medicare instead of group health plan coverage. And so when we see any language in the SPD or the employee handbook that encourages members to move off the plan or suggests that the plan may treat somebody who is eligible for Medicare or also entitled to Medicare differently than it would other plan participants, that's extremely problematic. We can't encourage members to elect Medicare. It's still prohibited under the rules. What you can do is educate. And there is a difference between education and encouragement. And you really just do have to walk that line very carefully. CMS has essentially said that employers can provide factual, non-directional information about Medicare, but it has to be a very neutral statement about sort of the potential availability of Medicare or where a member could go for education that is unbiased. And that place doesn't also encourage them. You can't do that. It has to be neutral, unbiased education. And you never want to suggest that the member should terminate health coverage under the plan in any capacity, but where you can sort of educate in a neutral way without moving into encouragement, that's a way to do it compliantly. So like John mentioned earlier, it really is walking that fine line that can sometimes be blurry, but there is a line in between those. And it's really just sort of a balancing act, making sure that you don't sort of tiptoe into encouragement and you stay on that education and that sort of neutral standpoint. But these rules are very complex. Sometimes they seem really straightforward, and then the more you dive into them, the more nuanced they get. So if you have questions about what's possible, what's not possible, is something you're doing compliant, is it bleeding too much into encouragement, you can always reach out to us. We get these questions really, really frequently. So we feel we're well equipped to help you guys. But John, anything else to add?
No, I don't think so. We could probably talk all day about this, and I have before, and it's hard to do. It's hard to listen to, but
Yeah.
it's got to be said. But no, I think this is a good stopping point for now. And yeah, like Kendall said, if there are questions, concerns, or if you do any of the stuff that we said you probably shouldn't do, feel free to reach out. We can help. We can provide guidance on particular scenarios or language. We're always here to help. So yeah, thank you so much for tuning in. And one way or another, hopefully we will talk soon. So thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.